Hidden off the coast of Rhode Island is a tiny piece of land off limits to the public. This island has stood as a unique piece of American history since the 17th century, from its early days as the setting for 18th century politics to its role as one of the most valuable resources to the American Navy during World War II. Gould Island has been integral to the story of the United States, so join me as we discover its history. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Let's start with the basics. Gould Island is a tiny landmass, measuring about 1,000 yards long and 225 yards wide, with a total area of about 50 acres. These days, the land here is divided in half, with a chain-link fence, with the north side completely inaccessible to the public as it's used by the US Navy, and the south side of the fence features a bird sanctuary owned and operated by the state of Rhode Island, and it allows occasional visitors with a special permit. But hundreds of years before the sanctuary and naval space were set up, the situation looked entirely different. Back then, Gould Island was a piece of land controlled by Native Americans, which ultimately sold the property to European settlers decades before the Declaration of Independence was written. The Narragansett people have lived in Rhode Island for centuries, but are also impactful in modern times for their involvement in the 2009 Supreme Court case, which established that the federal government officially recognized Native tribes, in a sense taking the 1934 Indian Recognition Act one step further, as it became impossible to seize their lands into a government trust. The tribe did not receive federal recognition until 1983. As of 2022, they remain the only recognized tribe originating and based in Rhode Island. Anyhow, when British colonialists came to the future United States, the land that would one day become Gould Island was owned by the Narragansett tribe, who had a name for it in their own language. From there, the island changed ownership several times. In 1657, the property belonged to the grandson of a prominent tribal leader, Canonicus. Canonicus was a major figure in the earliest pilgrim settlement of North America, and as you might imagine, the relationship between the native people and the pilgrims was initially violent. On March the 28th, 1657, Thomas Gould, an early colonialist, bought the island from the natives and renamed the space after himself. He remained the owner of the island for 16 years until giving half of it to John Cranston, a physician and politician. A year later, Cranston gave away half of his land to another politician, Caleb Carr. Throughout the 18th century, Gould Island changed owners several more times. During the Revolutionary War, the ownership became entangled in political conflict, and it was this era where it became the property of Rhode Island for the first time. Then the saga really began on August the 12th, 1700, when Samuel Cranston, the son of John Cranston and the governor of the colony of Rhode Island under the Royal Charter, gave half of that land away to Caleb Carr's son, Nicholas. Following Nicholas's passing, his will sold 144 acres of his land, including portions of Gould Island, to Colonel Joseph Watton Jr. for £41,000. From there, Edward and Sarah Carr, Nicholas's close relatives, sold the remainder of the land to Watton for £4,000. 8 years later, Watton's father was elected and consistently re-elected as the royal governor of Rhode Island. Hence, the family retained control. Joseph Watton Sr.'s political career took a hit as the American Revolution began. Watton Sr. was politically a loyalist, refusing to support the Patriot cause, and using his power as governor to permit officers to join Washington's troops. This action was rooted in the belief that the war would harm the well-being of Rhode Island. In other words, his support was for King George. In response, the Rhode Island General Assembly blocked Watton Sr. from beginning his 7th term, and he was unable to complete the oath of office. His replacement, Nicholas Cook, led Rhode Island through the war. The Watton family did not back down without a fight, remaining stubborn in their views and denouncing the revolution. On Christmas of 1775, Joseph Jr. was formally asked to renounce his political opinions and commit to potentially joining the Patriot Army in the 18th century version of the draft. He refused and was temporarily placed into police custody but released just days later. Unlike his father, Joseph Jr. was a proud loyalist. On July the 8th of the following year, he was forced to vacate his property as the war raged in Rhode Island. During this time, Joseph Jr. continued to support the Loyalist cause as the British Army captured the nearby islands, remaining in Newport and recruiting Loyalist soldiers. He remained in Newport as well until 1779, when he moved to New York City along with the British Army, simply abandoning his political career in Rhode Island, where he was once the Colonel Deputy Governor. Joseph Wanton Jr. became involved in New York politics. He quickly became the New York City Superintendent of Police. Later that year, the state of Rhode Island removed Wanton Jr.'s state assets under the decision that he was, quote, an alien to the colony. In other words, the state now possessed the island and various other local properties. Joseph Wanton Jr. died on August the 8th, 1780, and his widow attempted to regain the land from the state, but her petitions failed. Gould Island would not remain in the state's sole custody for long, as on August the 3rd, 1803, Newport local Caleb Gardner bought the land at the state auction. Throughout the 19th century, the island passed through various owners, most of whom were local at first, but by 1851, the island became a vacation home to multiple New York families. As Gould Island was transferred into a vacation getaway, military technology was expanding, specifically with regard to torpedoes. In 1869, the United States Navy created the Newport Naval Torpedo Station on nearby Gould Island. The technology further developed, and the coast became an asset for the Navy. In 1887, the Fall River Steamship Line, which was part of a multi-method transportation line traveling from New York City to Boston, built a navigation light on Gould Island, which sat on the east side. 2 years later, a lighthouse was built. The land used was sold to the federal government for $2,500 and replaced a privately owned light at 250 feet north. The landowner, Francis E. Holmes, agreed to sell on the condition that Edmund Taylor became the first lighthouse keeper. Taylor was also the keeper of the previous light, hence in a somewhat literal sense the torch was passed. Anyhow, the lighthouse was in service until 1947. The Navy continued to test its weapons in the nearby bay, but ownership of Gould Island continued to pass through the turn of the century. By 1911, Gwendolyn Howell was the owner, and her husband, Percy D. Houghton, brought the island into the press. Houghton was also the coach of Harvard's football team, and utilized the island as their summer training grounds. Unfortunately, the space wasn't safe for long, as the First World War began just 3 years later. Torpedoes constitute a significant asset for naval warfare. With that in mind, Gould Island was hit by multiple explosions in 1918, with 14 combined deaths, and explosives were soon moved off the island. However, it was around this time that the government seized Gould Island for naval use under the consent of Congress. The private owners were moved out by October of 1918, with the government beginning a major construction project on the island that unfolded over the next 2 years. Torpedo, aircraft, and additional structures were also built in the same year. Gould Island made history for the United States Navy with its mechanical innovations. On November the 2nd, 1921, the first successful American airdrop of a torpedo was completed on the island coast. The Navy continued to expand its use of the island throughout the first half of the 20th century, especially during World War II. However, right before the war, a hurricane brought nearly $18,000 in damage to the Navy's structures on the island. The 1938 hurricane brought unprecedented destruction, breaking down the doors of the airplane hangar and sinking the entire plane that fell loose and drifted north off the coast. That plane's remains eventually washed up on the coast of Beaver Trail Lighthouse in Jamestown. Significant damages left 9 planes in need of urgent care. Unlike the past explosions on Gould Island, the environmental disasters didn't sway the Navy from using Gould Island as a testing site. Following the repairs, torpedoes began test drops in 1939. Throughout the Second World War, over 4,000 tests were done on the coast. The torpedoes used are called Mark 13 and are significant for their turbine-powered design, which became a standard during the war. Since the Navy was at the core of Pearl Harbor, America's entrance into World War II, naval warfare, which heavily featured torpedoes, became central to the war effort. 2 months after the attack, on February 7, 1942, new construction on Gould Island created a new firing pier. According to the Library of Congress, this pier was the third section of a Navy's operational triad during the war. 100 torpedoes could be launched each day. The pier's structure was built to accommodate nearby American ships so they could move freely without collision. The first firing test occurred on October the 23rd, but construction wouldn't be completed for another year. Nearby, another pillar of the triad was built at Coddington Cove in Middleton, also in Rhode Island. This building was used for research and development of these naval weapons and transferred Gould Island's resources and staff. The islands were constantly in contact as travel to Gould Island was primarily taken directly from Coddington Cove. Throughout the war, the Navy constantly expanded its facilities on Gould Island. In 1944, a degaussing station was built to monitor the magnetic signatures of nearby ships. This was to prevent potential magnetic mine explosions. As the war wound down, so would the usefulness of the island, and in a mere decade, it would see its downfall. 2 years after the war ended, the island's lighthouse was shut down for a time, ultimately to be replaced with a steel tower. But in 1960, the entire lighthouse was outright torn down, with the metal structure now flashing a green light. 6 years after the war ended, Gould Island shifted its focus from the production of torpedoes to specific research related to submarines. The test facility became part of Coddington Cove's operations, and the Naval Torpedo Station in Washington State took over torpedo storage and maintenance. Gould Island would no longer be an integral element of the Navy. Furthermore, the American Navy decided that they no longer needed control of the island. So in 1975, they began to transfer the majority of the property back to the state of Rhode Island. By 1989, the state owned about 39 acres of land, with the Navy remaining in control over the section with the firing pier to this very day. 4 of the Navy's buildings on the north, which are still in naval possession, have been certified as historic by both the Navy and Rhode Island's Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission. The late 1980s was a period of reconstruction for the island. On October the 24th, 1988, the navigation tower was temporarily put out of commission when the base crumbled, knocking over the steel tower. Just over a year later, on November the 21st, 1989, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency included concerns about Gould Island on their list of national priorities. This statement described how various forms of waste surrounded the island as a result of nearby disposal within the bay. Despite these concerns, little was done to resolve or preserve the island. In June of 1999, the 4 buildings designated as historic were torn down by the Navy, as they hadn't been used for decades. The firing pier remained with occasional use for testing. Deconstruction continued into the 2000s, including upper portions of the firing pier. Following this demolition, the Navy agreed to create an exhibit dedicated to Gould Island's war contributions that was featured in the Naval War College Museum of 2003. For the next 15 years, the island faded from public and government view. The Navy's property was practically untouched, and the government's property, which at this point was a bird sanctuary, became only intermittently open to the public. Interest in Gould Island was renewed in the late 2010s, when federal efforts to clean up the area were renewed. In 2017, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began the planning stages of the island's restoration, slowly removing the buildup of debris littering the entire space. This was a slow process, as the Army Corps simultaneously tested the remains for any contamination. The Rhode Island Historical Preservation and Heritage Commission voiced their support for this project, putting out a statement on September the 29th, 2017. With the tension on Gould Island now renewed, the federal government voiced concerns about funding, as the island was shared property between Rhode Island and the Navy. The Army Corps completed its project in 2022, which, despite the controversy, went according to plan. In January of 2023, the town of Jamestown asked the city of Newport to support the restoration project following advice from Rhode Island's federal congressional delegation. The Jamestown project plans to begin work in 2024, hoping to make the island safe and accessible to the public. These discussions and negotiations within local governments continue to this very day. Although it's faded from the spotlight, literally in the case of the lighthouse anyways, Gould Island remains an iconic part of American history that has been integral to the structure of the United States, both federally and as a part of Rhode Island. And with that in mind, I'd argue that its story deserves to live on to see another day. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.